Welcome all to our Sunday morning adult school. Sunday school for the adults, for the grown-ups. Yes. It is Sunday, the last Sunday of the month of June, the 28th here in 2024. And we are going through the Bible timeline currently in Exodus chapter 12. So this brings us to the year 1446 BC. The month of Abib or Nisan on the Hebrew calendar, the 15th now. We're on the day after the Passover. On our calendar, it'd work out to be about Thursday, April 23rd, 1446 BC. These Israelites have been there in Egypt for 215 years, been enslaved for 99 years. We're in the Middle Bronze Age 2B, A going into B, that kind of overlap. Way over in China, they're being led by Emperor Wairen of their Shang dynasty. Egypt is being led by Pharaoh Dudamos II. He is this Pharaoh of the Exodus here. He's from their 13th dynasty in their second intermediate period. We're after the high point of Joseph and Egypt's middle kingdom. And later on will be the new kingdom with King Tut and Ramses and all of that. We're in between those in this intermediate period. In the Bible lands, Babylon is being led by King Amidatana, who is the great-grandson of Hammurabi. And here in Egypt, with the Lord's people in the line of Christ, we have Aminadab, whom I'm putting at about 98. His son Nahshon, I'm putting at about 39. And Nahshon will be the leader of the tribe of Judah for the Exodus. So let's refresh Exodus 12, picking up in verses 28 through 29. Then the sons of Israel went and did so, just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. Now it came about at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of cattle. Again, this was a very, very selective event by the hand of God. There is no random natural occurrence that would select the firstborn of all of these people who had not had the covering of the blood of the lamb applied. So with that, I thought I'd start by bringing up something that was presented Wednesday night. Messianic Jewish Rabbi Jonathan Cahn, in his book, The Josiah Manifesto, he said this, and I shared this Wednesday night. If one had to sum up the message of Passover in a single statement, it could read, "We were saved from bondage, judgment, and death by the blood of the Passover lamb." If one had to sum up the message of the gospel, it could read, "We were saved from bondage, judgment, and death by the blood of Messiah, the Passover lamb." The Christian faith is a Passover faith, and the gospel message is the message of Passover. The Hebrew word for feast, for this feast, Pesach, actually means the Passover lamb. It was all leading up to the lamb. So I really appreciate that focus here. Let's get our screen share going. So we're getting the timeline stuff outside the Bible from Egyptologist David Roll. So the Israelites are in Egypt, and we are 1446. Let's go to, right. We actually left off last week with the Ipuwer Papyrus. This was an Egyptian document, looks to be dated to this time frame at the end of the 13th dynasty, though some don't agree with that because of their understanding of the timeline and whatnot. But this exactly describes so many of the things that we associate from the Bible with the Exodus. It talks about the river turning to blood. It talks about the darkness. It talks about the plague of death. It talks about the slaves being adorned with the riches of their former masters. Everything that the Bible, all these things that are described in the Bible are described in the secular Egyptian document. That fits this time frame very well. So that was of significance. So let's go to close you. There's Mount. We talked about that on Crete. So talking about these plague pits as a result of all of this. Here's a thought from David Roll, kind of summing some of this stuff up. In the archaeological excavation here at Tel Adaba, Middle Bronze Age 2A, again, A going into B. This last phase of stratum G, so again, the layers, the deeper down you go, the older in time you go. So going back up, now up to stratum G. So the last phase here of civilization had come to a sudden and dramatic end. And this is the story being told by the dirt, by the archaeology, by society's history here in the relics. A catastrophe had struck Avaris, readily apparent from these scores of shallow burial pits found all over the site. Bodies had been thrown into hastily dug graves, face down on top of each other. There were no burial goods to accompany the deceased, no pottery for the afterlife, no bronzes to protect the dead in the other world. The town had been struck, causing hundreds of deaths and an emergency internment of the victims. The main part of the settlement, where the Semites or Asiatics were concentrated, was equally suddenly abandoned and left deserted for a period of time. Again, this is towards the end of Middle Bronze 2A archaeological period. Archaeology confirms a terrible event with numerous death pits, followed immediately by the abandonment of the main eastern suburb of the town by the foreigners, leaving only the Egyptian houses still occupied, which fits the 10th plague and the Exodus that we've been looking at here. Get that there. A messenger angel of God had been the agent of destruction, the destroyer per the Bible. The might of Yahweh had thus been demonstrated far beyond anyone's imaginings. The Egyptians were in total shock. They pleaded with the Israelites to take themselves and their devastating God as far away from Egypt as they could go. The citizens of Avaris, here in the land of Goshen, forced their golden possessions upon those who had once been their servants and sent them on their way to the place where Moses was gathering his people together. So I appreciate the perspective from an Egyptologist describing the evidence that we're seeing here. So any reactions to this or anything brought up or mentioned so far this morning? Good. Yeah, Sister Diana. Yeah. That is funny, yes. The king had his summer residence there, and that gone back to several dynasties, even the 10th dynasty, where Abraham met his king, Kedi IV from the 10th dynasty, and being closer to them on the Mediterranean coast here. And so, yeah, so within that town, you had your different suburbs where the different folks were hanging out. So yeah, that is kind of interesting description there. Everyone else all good? Let's continue on in Exodus with verse 30 of chapter 12, Exodus 12, picking up in 30. And Pharaoh got up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians. And there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was no home where there was not someone dead. Then he called for Moses and Aaron at night and said, "Rise up, get out from among my people, both you and the sons of Israel, and go worship the Lord as you have said. Take both your flocks and your herds as you have said, and go and bless me also." Pause there. What strikes me about that, reading it again, is how many times Pharaoh says, "as you have said." And my thought is, well, if you just done it the first time, as they had said, none of this would have happened. But we know what all needed to play out. And human nature being human nature, and God, of course, having the final say, hardening the heart once they had hardened it on their own enough. So now he's saying, go, go, go. Oh, and by the way, bless me also. The guy who had been so anti their God, who is this God of yours that I should even be concerned about what he has to say? Now he's saying, after all of this, after he'd been in denial and rebellion against this God of the Hebrews, now he says, bless me also. So it sounds like he's finally pretty broken here. It only cost the death of his firstborn son and taking the nation down with him. And again, we know about his firstborn son. He was in his mid-20s, as we mentioned here. Hey, darn it. And so, let's see. They are finally given Pharaoh's permission to leave, not that he was in any position, but he finally gives permission to leave. And he says, "Go, go, go, and by the way, bless me also." The guy who had been so anti their God, who is this God of yours that I should even be concerned about what he has to say? Now he's saying, after all of this, after he'd been in denial and rebellion against this God of the Hebrews, now he's saying, bless me also. So it sounds like he's finally pretty broken here. It only cost the death of his firstborn son and taking the nation down with him. And again, we know about his firstborn son. He was in his mid-20s, as we mentioned here. to deny them. And so this brings us to the last of the slideshow from PowerPoint, courtesy of Pastor Mike Maney of the church in Missoula, Montana. So let's wrap up here the 10th and final plague. Start here, get my screen to match your screen. And we are in business. So the 10th plague. They're the scriptures that we've seen where the death of the firstborn takes place. It says this final strike was intended by Yahweh from the beginning when he first commissioned Moses to confront Pharaoh. And there's the scripture. Let's see if I can move that thing out the way. Yeah, from Exodus chapter 4, where that was referenced. There we go. The strike began with Israel's plundering of Egypt. God gave his people their wages for their hard labor as slaves. I'd never thought of that as reparations, but hey. And then we have from Exodus 11, the scriptures referring to taking the plunder from the people. Moses explains to Pharaoh what is about to happen. As we saw, he gave him the heads up. And there again, Exodus chapter 11. Pharaoh was forewarned of the effects of the strike. Again, Exodus 11, he tells them this is the next thing that's going to happen. And considering Moses' track record, 9 out of 10 times he's been right. But still, things were going to play out the way they were going to play out. So we see here too, going into chapter 12, as the Lord describes it, Israel's ceremonial calendar is established with Abib, Nisan being the first of the month for them. Circle this day in red. Israel's first major feast, the Passover, is established. They bring the lamb into their individual households on the 10th of Nisan or Abib, and then the sacrifice is made at twilight on the 14th, just as Christ was sacrificed at 3 o'clock on the Passover, Nisan the 14th. Oops. And there it is referenced in Exodus chapter 12. The strike was upon the firstborn of Egypt. Every firstborn son or daughter of a family in all the land of Egypt would die, same for all the firstborn of their livestock.
See, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Did not know livestock as well.
Yep. So now I'm not a farmer. I'm not a rancher. Now I'd be happy if my piggy had a bunch of little pigs or my cow had a bunch of little cows. But now I'm not sure if I'd be able to keep track of which was the firstborn.
Exactly, because they reproduce every year.
Right.
So how many of them were actually, there had to be
It definitely
a year.
harmed them.
That first,
Yeah.
you know, that the first pregnancy.
Mm-hmm.
While the other ones were spared.
Right.
Yeah.
So even though I might not be able to keep track, God, who knows the very numbers of our head, God knows which one is the firstborn. And God, so he doesn't need anyone or anything to aid him in this. He is the author of all life, author and finisher of all life. So there's that. And then as we just read, Pharaoh woke up. And so that is where we will stop for that share here. So any thoughts, reactions on the slideshow courtesy of Brother Maney? I appreciate that he had this all put together and we were able to benefit from it. Yeah, good stuff. So stopping that, getting back to this. All right, so let's continue reading then. Next couple verses, picking up in verse 33. Exodus 12:33. The Egyptians urged the people to send them out of the land in a hurry, for they said, "We will all be dead." So the people took their dough before it was leavened, with their kneading bowls bound up in the clothes on their shoulders. Now the sons of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, for they had requested from the Egyptians articles of silver and articles of gold and clothing, and the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have their request. Therefore they plundered the Egyptians. Again, just as the Lord foretold, so it happened and played out. exactly as that Egyptian document, the Admonitions of an Egyptian Sage, or the Ipuwer Papyrus, as it's called, which is now in the Leiden Museum in the Netherlands. This document described all these things. And here they are playing out just as scripture tells. So all good here. Now we're getting to it. Now we're going to talk about the scriptures that were prophesied about these events hundreds of years before they happened, because this is all coming to a head here. The deliverance is beginning here 430 years since Abraham was in Egypt. So let's go back to the prophecy here. So let's read about this. Exodus 12, pick up in verse 40. Exodus 12, verse 40. Now, this is how the Septuagint reads. Yours might read a little different. Now, the time that the sons of Israel had lived in Egypt and in the land of Canaan was 430 years. And at the end of 430 years, on this very day, all the multitudes of the Lord departed from the land of Egypt during the night. It is a night to be observed for the Lord, for having brought them out of the land of Egypt, this night is for the Lord, to be observed by all the sons of Israel throughout their generations. So we see a timing here, 430 years, both in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan. Doing the math, it just so happens to work out to be 215 years in each. It's not required to be that way. That's just how the math plays out with the ages and how old they were at the time they gave birth to their sons and so on and so forth. So we have that laid out for us. Basically, Jacob came into Egypt the year 1661 BC, 215 years after Abraham came to Egypt, his grandpa, and 215 years before the Exodus. It just happened to be that midway point right there.
Or you got the 40, did you read 43 yet?
No.
Okay. Well, wait.
Yeah, we're not on 43 just yet. So this is also referenced, we can hold a place in Exodus 12, in Acts chapter 13. Acts chapter 13, one verse 37. Acts 13, 17, my mistake. Acts 13, verse 17. So Paul is preaching a message here. Acts 13, 17. The God of this people Israel chose our fathers and made the people great during their stay in the land of Egypt, and with an uplifted arm, he led them out from it. So here it is taking place. This is also referenced in the book of Hebrews. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 27. Hebrews 11:27, we're told about Moses. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he persevered as though seeing him who is unseen. So there's the faith of Moses, trusting in God more than he's trusting in Pharaoh. Remember, he had grown up under an earlier Pharaoh's household, so he's familiar with them. He saw that greater is God than the Pharaoh he had lived under. And this also brings us to Numbers chapter 33, where we're given the itinerary for the journey that is about to take place. Numbers 33, first 4 verses. Number 33, verse 1. These are the journeys of the sons of Israel, by which they came out of the land of Egypt by their armies, under the leadership of Moses and Aaron. Moses recorded their starting places according to their journeys by the command of the Lord, and these are their journeys according to their starting places. Now they journeyed from Ramses in the first month, on the 15th day of the first month, on the day after the Passover. The sons of Israel started out boldly in the sight of all the Egyptians, while the Egyptians were burying all their firstborn, whom the Lord had fatally struck among them. The Lord had also executed judgments against their gods. Wow, that's a pretty powerful statement there, that the very next day after this devastation, While the Egyptians are still burying their dead, here are the former slaves rising up, taking their treasures, and walking out. And the Egyptians can do nothing about it at this moment in time. So, and as I said here, the Lord had executed judgment against their gods. We saw how he was just taking them out one by one with each of the plagues there. So again, really can't overstate how powerful and impactful what is happening here is in the course of spiritual history, of course, and even world history. Other nations, this is going to reverberate throughout Egyptian history and the history of the nations around here that Israel is going to be dealing with. So anything on those verses right there from anyone? All good? So again, 430 years since Abraham was in Egypt. Well, let's take a quick look back in that. Genesis chapter 12. Howdy. Genesis chapter 12, verse 10, we see Abram making his way to Egypt. Interestingly enough, for a similar reason, Genesis 12:10, now there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a time because the famine was severe in the land. This is 1876 BC. This is 430 years before the Exodus in 1446 BC. The Exodus is also 400 years. You may have heard of scripture saying 430 years, 400 years. What's the difference? Well, Abraham was in Egypt and the Promised Land for 25 years before Isaac was born. And then Isaac lived to be 5 years old. And at the time of his 5-year-old weaning is when his older brother Ishmael was mocking him. And that was the beginning of the seed of Abraham, represented by Isaac, suffering in the land that's not theirs, and which was the Promised Land that wasn't theirs yet, and Egypt. And that's 400 years before the Exodus. So let's take a look. Genesis 21, verse 9. So this is 30 years after Abraham is in Egypt. Genesis 21, verse 9. Genesis 21:9. So now we're 1846 BC. Now Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, mocking Isaac. This kicks off the 400 years of suffering at the hands of the locals in a land that's not their own. And so this Isaac is who this is happening through as the seed of Abraham. And this again is 1846 BC, 30 years after Abraham came to Egypt, and exactly 400 years before the Exodus of 1446 BC. And this prophecy is given in Genesis 15. God tells Abraham about this. Genesis 15, verse 13. Then God said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. Notice nowhere in Genesis 15:13 do you see the word Egypt, because it's not limited to Egypt. It's a big misconception that the Israelites were enslaved 400 years. And also notice, as we saw from Exodus chapter 12, how the Septuagint correctly shows they were in Egypt and the land of Canaan 430 years, from Abraham down to the Exodus here. They were not in Egypt 400 years or 430 years. They were only in Egypt 215 years, as the math happens to work out. This promise of God is also referenced, I'll just pull this up real quick here, by Stephen in Acts chapter 7, verse 6. Acts 7, verse 6. Stephen reminds the Jews who are accusing him of what God had done. Acts 7, verse 6. But God spoke to this effect, that his descendants would be strangers in a land that was not theirs. They would enslave and mistreat them for 400 years. Some of that time was being mistreated. Some of it was being enslaved. And so we see that playing out over the course of these 400 years since Ishmael started taunting Isaac 400 years before the Exodus. So there's all that timeline of prophecy being fulfilled. Any questions or thoughts or reactions to all of that being presented? All fits, all makes sense, all good. Sister Diana.
That Sarah was kind of causing all his family hassles. Or Abraham said,
Yeah.
Ew.
What do you do is you man up. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And again, and I appreciate how this was portrayed in the film His Only Son, which, different thoughts on that. But one thing I do appreciate that was portrayed was how hard it probably was for Sarah to suggest the whole Ishmael thing. How hard, what a sacrifice that was on her part. Well, the prophecy, what God mentioned your name, he didn't mention me. And so it's not happening with me. So maybe it means to be, maybe I need to make a sacrifice and bow myself out of the picture here. Let you move on. How hard that must be. What a huge sacrifice. Now, obviously we understand misunderstanding God and getting the promise in the scriptures wrong. And that later gets presented and corrected. But while we can rightfully talk about in human nature, taking things into our own hands when we need to stop and let God do his thing, we can also understand the brokenheartedness and the doubting of her own self, where I think one of Satan's biggest tools is our own insecurities and our own unsettledness. And as a 54-year-old man, as an ordained pastor who spent a couple of years pastoring here and elsewhere, I am still to this day, June of 2024, shocked and amazed by how insecure and unsettled most people are, even in the church. And so that's just a reality. And so I appreciate you bringing this up because it's a very important tangent. That's why it's so important that we see God being with the people who are with him, which is available for anyone to be a part of. And if we are with him, just like Solomon, we keep ourselves humble and seeking and desiring what he has, he is faithful, he provides. We have every reason not to be insecure. We have every reason not to be unsettled, but to be settled because of the Lord who we are with and who is with us as we place ourselves in him and he provides and brings us under his care, as is being powerfully, undeniably brought out by Egypt being brought down and Israel, the nation, being lifted up. Notice they were going out in their armies. These were slaves. Now they're going out in their armies in battle formation. This is something, remember, Moses has experience as an Egyptian army commander. So there's that too. So a really powerful juxtaposition here. So good stuff. Really glad you brought that out. Any other thoughts on any of this? Yeah. Right. And there's the faithfulness and provision of God. Even though human nature carried out something that was not God's plan A, God was still faithful even to Ishmael and even to Hagar. God, the one almighty, one true God, had direct one-on-one interaction with Hagar. The first time she ran away and told her to go on back. And even at the second time where she's crying and thinking her son's going to die. He's in his late teens here. And so we see that God was faithful to provide for her. And here's Abraham burdened when God says, it's okay, Sarah's right, and that there needs to be a separation here. And Abraham is aching because that is his son. And God says, I'm going to be faithful. I'm going to provide for him. Now Ishmael is going to make his own choices just like anyone else. But God was still faithful even to Ishmael in his provision and care. And so even though God could have within his rights to say, well, that's a result of your own choices that were contrary to me, so you get what you get. No, God is faithful, though we don't always carry out God's plan A. He is faithful to provide for us, even if we miss plan A and get on board at plan B. And God will always be faithful to bring us. Now, we may have missed out on some of the blessings by missing plan A, but God is still faithful and will carry us and see us through as he was with all these people. So great stuff. And it directly leads to what got us here. As Abraham came down to Egypt, so too, foreshadowing, 430 years later, now they are leaving Egypt. And so with that, let's go to switch gears a little bit. I'm going to share between Egyptologist David Roll and Dr. Glenn Fritz here on his book, so with the dealing with the Exodus. So taking a cue from him in his book on the Lost Sea of the Exodus, he mentions that the Bible is also connecting the Hebrew habitation where they lived with Zoan. go to Psalm 72. So let's see, let me pick up, going to Zoan here. A little bit up here. There we go. So Psalm 78. 7:8. Psalm 7:8. Apologies if I misspoke any earlier. Psalm 78. Verse 12. Psalm 78, verse 12. He performed wonders before their fathers in the land of Egypt, in the field of Zoan. You also skip down to verse 43. Psalm 78, verse 43. When he performed his signs in Egypt and his marvels in the field of Zoan. Well, where is Zoan? Right here. Let me give you a zoom out for a bit. So here's the nation of Egypt. There's the Sinai Peninsula. Here's Mount Sinai. Here's Midian. And here's the Promised Land. And Babylon's way off over here. So here in the land of Goshen, we have, zoom in down here. And of course, it froze, which it does, but it's easy to get back up. So north of Avaris is this town of Zoan. Right there, which is also known as Tanis. Now, if there are any 80s movie buffs here, you might be wondering why the name Tanis is familiar. So here's Avaris right here, and here's Tanis to the north, Zoan. So just take a look here. Tanis, you might know from the movie from 1981, Raiders of the Lost Ark, where Indiana Jones turns to his Egyptian friend Salah and says, the Nazis have found Tanis. Well, Tanis was never missing, first off. And secondly, we're told in the movie that when the Pharaoh of Egypt invaded Jerusalem under the reign of Solomon's son and took treasures with him, that one of those treasures was the Ark of the Covenant, hence Raiders of the Lost Ark. So the Nazis are digging in Tanis, thinking that that's where the Ark of the Covenant had been brought. And as the movie plays out, that's what the movie portrays. Well, the problem is that later on in scriptures, we're told about the Ark of the Covenant still being in there in Jerusalem later on in time. And so it was not taken to Egypt at this time. So Steven Spielberg could do a little more Jewish research and whatnot, but still fun stuff nonetheless. And I still recommend the movie. So here is what's there at Tanis now. And the point we're making here with the Exodus is that as Psalm 78 shows, the Hebrew Semite population included Tanis up here. It wasn't just limited to Avaris. That was sort of the main headquarters location. Yay. I think that was put in later. So you get the idea here. So Psalm 78 mentions Tanis in context of the Exodus and the workings of God here. Tanis is 13 miles north of Avaris Tel Adaba. So talking about this land here where the Israelites are, even back in 1839, an explorer named Edward Robinson describes this land of Goshen as the best land of Egypt, valued at a larger sum than any other province, except for there's like one other. In his day, it was considered the best province because it intersected with canals that were lying lower than the Nile, so it was much more easily irrigated. It also supported more flocks and herds than anywhere else in Egypt. So no coincidence, the Bible talks about this being the best of the land where the Israelites were. And by the way, this name Avaris, as we mentioned under the time of Joseph, it comes from the Egyptian word Hawara, which means the house of the department, one of the headquarters Joseph had set up in his preparations for the famine. He had one up here and one further south. But even more important, let's go to this here. Flashback over to slide 38. So we've got Ramses on the top here, built later on top of what's underneath is Avaris. So Avaris itself, as we're seeing here at the end of the 13th dynasty, it lies on top of 12th dynasty ruins that go back to Pharaoh Amenemhat I, main leader of the 12th dynasty kicking off. So with this main mound here, we see 5 notable strata going up from the 12th dynasty ruins into this early 13th dynasty. So you go from H, G4, G3, G2, and G1. These layers show continuous occupation by these Semites, these Asiatics, who are Egyptianized, but retained their culture from Syria, Canaan. What do we see in the ground here? The chronology sequence shows, this is not, we're setting the Bible aside for a moment, just what does the ground tell us? Shows a 12th dynasty arrival of these Semites, these Asiatics, their initial settlement in layer G4. At that time, the place was not known as Avaris, it was known as Roarti, the mouth of the two ways, because the Nile branched off, their Pelusiac branched into 2 channels here. So what do we see digging up through the ground? We see that these Semites developed into a thriving population. So let's go to, so here's a recreation of the Israelite houses, and there are the Egyptian houses off to the side here in the water. So yeah, quite a big spread here. So rapid expansion of a thriving population mirrors the experience of Jacob's descendants, as we saw Exodus 1:7, population growing. But years later, many burials appear, showing untimely infant and adult deaths. 65% of the burials were children, almost 2/3. 65% of the burials were children under 18 months of age, which far exceeds what we usually see, 20 to 30% in these pre-modern societies. The adult deaths were from deprivation and illness. These findings bring to mind Pharaoh's order to kill the infant Hebrew males, Exodus 1:16, as well as the hardships imposed by enslavement. Also, the dominance of adult female burials at Avaris suggests the culling of the males. So within the period of these Semites, these Asiatics being present here, we have a large Egyptian-style tomb. This is Joseph's palace field. There it is being excavated. And we have this Egyptian-style palace tomb. And we've got a total of 12 burials here, 12 tombs here, kind of interesting. But this Egyptian-style tomb that was erected for a prominent Semitic or Asiatic ruler. So Egyptian tomb for someone who's not Egyptian. The tomb remnants included a statue of the deceased wearing a multicolored coat. When discovered, the grave had been plundered and the bones were missing. But grave robbers always leave the bones because they don't sell for much on eBay. They have no use for them or Craigslist. Hence, this circumstance suggests correlation with the biblical Joseph, who was embalmed and put in a coffin, Genesis 50, verse 26, but whose bones were later taken along in the Exodus, which we'll get to in Exodus 13:19. So at the end of stratum G1, reflecting now the 13th dynasty, many careless burials in shallow pits appeared. So the Austrian archaeologist Manfred Bietak, he interprets this as some kind of plague, or catastrophe here at Avaris. Then there was a sudden abandonment, followed by a stark archaeological hiatus or an absence. These findings may reflect the impact of the plagues and massive exodus depopulation. And so that's from Dr. Glenn Fritz, but here's something I'll add on this that others have said. All of these, to use the phrase, all of these patterns of the evidence for exactly what the Bible records within Egypt, all of this is found in no other place and no other time in all of Egypt. Only here, only at this time. And it all fits. So any thoughts or reactions to any of that? All good? Well, we will pick up in Exodus 12:37 next week, so that's a good stopping point for us today. If nothing further from anyone for now, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Let's go ahead and stop our screen share and stop recording, and let's get ready to go before the Lord in song.